There we go. Wonderful. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. This morning, we have an exciting webinar that'll feature a talk from my friend and colleague, Winston McLean, and we'll also share some information on the launch of our exciting new course, Indigenous Awareness for Co-op Leaders. My name's Kyle White, and I'm the Director of Education here at Co-operatives First. I'll be leading us through our time together today. Today, I'm joining you from Co-operatives First's office here in Saskatoon, and I'd like to acknowledge that our office is situated on Treaty 6 territory and the traditional homeland of the Métis. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're joined by people from all across Turtle Island, and I invite you to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples and ancestors of the place that you call home. I do want to say as well, in recognition of National Indigenous Peoples Day, we're celebrating the launch of our newest online course, Indigenous Awareness for Co-op Leaders. At Co-operatives First, we believe that all businesses in Canada should understand Indigenous history and its impact. And so we teamed up with Winston McLean and John Lagimodiere to build this course for Canadian cooperatives and credit unions. The course explores some terminology, important historical events, Canada's treaties with First Nations, and what role you can play in reconciliation. This free course is completely online, so you can complete it at your own pace from your office or the comfort of your own home. Over 5 modules in about 4 hours, John and Winston walk us through about 400 years of history and provide practical tips to consider in your workplace. Here's what one of the course participants had to say about the course. John and Winston are fantastic leaders to lead us on the journey to reconciliation. The material was very well presented and very well balanced in its content. This is a journey we all need to be on. Following today's webinar, you'll receive an email with today's recording and an invitation to sign up for this online course. But if you're eager to get started right away, I'll also share a link in the chat with you guys. So I'd like to introduce our speaker for the day. I will say John Lagimodiere was supposed to join us today, but he was called away to Ottawa, where he's joining a session of Parliament for a pretty important historic event. So we're joined today by Winston McLean. Winston is from the James Smith Cree Nation. He's a 5th-generation descendant of Treaty 6. After leaving the University of Saskatchewan with a degree in philosophy, he joined the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations. While with the FSIN, he gained experience in lands and resources, international affairs, and economic development. He was a member of the team that negotiated the Saskatchewan Treaty Land Entitlement Framework in 1992. Later, Winston worked on the First Nation and Métis Justice Reform Commission in 2002 as their Director of Operations. It was in connection with his work in land claims and injustice that Winston developed a profound respect for building bridges between mainstream and First Nation communities. Much of his work now is as a facilitator, working with corporate Canada and governments to deliver Indigenous awareness training. He also volunteers helping his First Nation deal with a major mining project that will have generational impacts. Winston lives in Saskatoon with his family, practices a martial art, and refuses to learn the banjo. Winston, we're so happy to have you with us today. The floor is yours, my friend.
Right, fantastic. Yeah, not going to do the banjo thing, just not going to happen. Sorry. Thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your busy schedules to come and join us here this morning. I've been asked to provide a bit of an update or an overview of the program that John and I recorded for Co-op First. And I'm going to start by beginning to share my screen. Does that did it turn up?
Perfect, looking good.
Fantastic. Doesn't look like something went weird on my end, but as long as you guys can see the slides, I'm happy. So yeah, I got one of the best jobs on the planet, really, when you think about it. I get paid to talk about my people. I have a blast while I'm doing it. So it's an awesome gig. I love what we get to do. I'm really glad we got to work with Co-op First to provide even more of this information, to get this information out there into the mainstream public. Because the game in this country has changed in terms of how folks and corporations and even governments, how they connect with our people. I don't know, many of you may have heard of this thing called the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. I know it's quite the mouthful, especially when you only had one cup of coffee in the morning. But basically what that is, it's the United Nations standard that tells nation states like Canada how they're to connect with their Indigenous populations. And while we do have some situations here in Canada, some of our brothers and sisters on the planet, they have it really rough. So elevating that standard is going to help out everyone globally. But closer to home, we have this thing called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. Now, just about everybody's heard of that. And what's really fantastic for a guy like, I've been in this business for a long time, like 3 decades, working for my people. And this is the first time I've ever seen a commission or inquiries, recommendations, or in this case, calls to action, ever get acted upon, not just by governments. We're seeing corporate Canada and communities, and they're embracing these things. They're trying to make these things happen. And that gives me like hope that the situation for my kids and my grandkids is going to be a lot better than I had when I was growing up. But we also have this thing called the duty to consult and accommodate, which has fundamentally altered how governments and corporate Canada engage our people when it comes to developing those projects in our backyards, in our traditional territories. And that's fantastic because that's getting our people engaged in the economy like never before. It's really kind of an exciting time to be in this business. But as you can imagine, because of certain policies and legislation, the curriculum kind of it failed us all in terms of who Indigenous people are and how we fit into Canada and Saskatchewan. And because the education's failed us all, and because of certain policies and legislation, we're missing out on certain opportunities. And we've all come across some of the myths and the misunderstandings, the misconceptions out there concerning our people and how we fit into Canada, and Saskatchewan in particular, which where I'm from. And as we all know, these myths and misconceptions, they can lead to missed opportunities. They can lead to sometimes tragic and even criminal outcomes too, right? So the way we see it, John and I, when we do these seminars, our job is to dissolve those myths and misconceptions, dissolve those in a good, constructive way. We have a few giggles along the way. We love what we get to do. We like to have a lot of fun in these things. And some of that's going to translate in the program we got for first. Because we're looking to dissolve those myths and misconceptions, dissolve them in a good, constructive way. So we can have good working relationships, good connections, good, healthy communications, not just in the workplace, but in the communities. Our workplaces are safe, right? We're being more productive. And people that jump on board in this particular bandwagon, if I can call it that, they get more customers. They get more loyal customers too, because in Indian country, good news, that's pretty fast, but bad news, that travels like light speed, right? Don't do business with those folks, it's kind of like a bad situation. But good news, it spreads like wildfire. So what John and I do, we try to make sure we provide good information across a wide variety of topics, so that good men and women from the mainstream can have good connections with us. They have a better understanding. They know how to navigate the terrain. Now, one of the problems that we have encountered in our travels is that the overwhelming majority of people in this country, they're good people. They just want to have good, decent connections with us, but they're afraid of saying the wrong thing. So they end up saying nothing at all. That's a missed opportunity. So what John and I do is we clarify the language, because the English language is not one vast synonym. Certain terms have very specific meanings. So we walk people through what those meanings are. There are certain legal distinctions, cultural distinctions as well. Aboriginal and Indigenous, for example, that's a lump word referring to 3 distinct groups under that heading. So if you ever hear somebody say, I want to talk about Métis and Aboriginal issues, or the Indigenous and First Nations people, that's being redundant. That kind of gives people away that they really don't know what they're talking about, that they don't know the stuff. So we make sure we walk you through the terminology, you're comfortable with it, and we also give you the history. So it makes it even easier to understand what these distinctions are all about. And then we also paint you a picture as to what the demographics, especially here in Saskatchewan, because that's what we're most familiar with, what the demographics look like in this province. We spend a little bit of time talking about this red square here, where all these costs are coming from and how they impact life as we know it today. We also talk about how making investments in the right kinds of things, like carpentry, for example, can lead to people participating in the economy. Right? So but to understand, where all this red stuff comes from, we have to talk about the history. And it also helps knowing the history also gives you an edge in terms of making those connections with our people too. Because we kind of remember that, we kind of sense that as well in our engagements. So we start talking about the pre-contacts. Before there was any fur traders or definitely any settlers in this neighborhood. We talk about what life looked like back in the day. how things functioned, how leadership worked, right? And we also describe how things changed when, for example, at Bozal, Christopher Columbus, yeah, we don't like Christopher Columbus very much, kind of a murderous SOB. I was encouraged to keep this a PG rated kind of seminar, so we're going to do that. Yeah, Christopher Columbus did a bunch of things that we're not very fond of, and especially this process called discovery, and which led to a process called colonization, right? We described some of the impacts of that, how that kind of manifested worldwide, the situation, the Canada's experience in a global context. We've also zeroed in on how the colonization process began here in Canada. We talk about how the English and the French, they had their conflicts as well, and how conflicts between the First Nations made it necessary that the British powers, British government, came to certain understandings with our people. And so we talk a little bit about international law and how and why First Nations people are regarded as nations under international law. We expand on this thing called the War Proclamation, which led to basically the treaty making process that would unfold ultimately out here in Western Canada. We also talk about how certain things changed in our game, in our life, that had an impact, that made it really necessary that we also have a good connection with the British government, the settler government. We talk about how these impacts reverberated through our communities and how that led to the treaty making process, and how we learned, for example, from our brothers and sisters out east, especially around the Great Lakes area. We asked them, how did things work out for you guys? And based on their experience, we negotiated a whole series of benefits that were accrued to us out here in Western Canada. So we talk also about, where did the reserves come from? Why are they so spread around? How did that happen? Why didn't they come together in a certain big group? This kind of makes sense. And we also talk about how we were going to make that transition from the old economies of the buffalo and the fur trade to the new one, which obviously was the beef farming. And how we were also promised during the treaty process that the crops ever failed, the Queen would take care of us, right? But that process got used and abused, and it actually led to the welfare system. So we share that story with you as well, because obviously that's having an impact even here today. But we also talk about what Canada got out of the deal. And we kind of compare that to what the American process was all about as well, to give some contrast and some understanding. We also describe what was and was not negotiated in these treaties to get people a better understanding as to how we are all treaty people, right? Even if your ancestors weren't there specifically when the treaties were signed, they were signed in anticipation of you being able to come out here into, for example, Treaty 6 territory to enjoy the benefits of living, having a good life off the land, which was part of the spirit and the intent of the treaties. And we unpack that concept too. But we also talk about the Métis story. Now, this is a story that doesn't often get shared in the media, or not in the media, well, also media, but also in the schools in particular, especially in high school. I know I, for one, I got a little bit of Métis history in my background as well. I was never taught this stuff, and there are reasons why that was never shared with us. So we talk about where the Métis people come from and how their culture, their governance, even today, is tied to this thing called the Buffalo Run. So we expand on that a little bit. We also talk about how the birth of the Métis is tied to a specific set of acts against British aggression in this territory. We also talk about how the Métis actually wanted to be part of Confederation. And this is a story that doesn't often get shared with the mainstream as well. And we also talk about how this process was actually kind of undermined. Even though Donald and Louis Riel, they were negotiating, things kind of went sideways. Even though things went sideways, we talk about how the Manitoba Act actually got signed and entrenched into the Constitution, right? We talk about the deal that the Métis people got out of that process, but how that process was also thwarted and kind of undermined, and how they lost all of their land, well, pretty much all of their land. We also talk about the Métis resistance. Now, I know in school we're taught that this is called the Louis Riel Rebellion. Those are very harsh terms, right? It was written by the Crown when they're putting together the curriculum. But the Métis themselves, they call it a resistance because they were resisting the further loss of their lands. And they describe how that process unfolded out here in what we now call Saskatchewan, especially in the Batoche area. We talk about how the loss of the Métis resistance, how that impacted their communities, and how they become ultimately landless. But we also talk about, and we often do this in all of our seminars, and this co-op first product is that you're going to be entertaining is the same way. We also want to make people realize that we are making progress, and the Métis people are no different. They've made a lot of progress in the last few decades, especially since the 60s and 70s, and now they're resuming their rightful place in Confederation. In fact, that's one of the reasons why my buddy John is in Ottawa to this day. Today, he's learning about what that process is going to start looking like for our Métis cousins, which is fantastic. Good things are happening. And by knowing this history, you also gain a certain kind of advantage in terms of connecting with our people. Now, we also talk about what happened to my people after we signed the treaties and we settled on the reserve. Now, this particular story, it explains a lot about what those situations you see on the streets, in your communities, the stuff you hear on Coffee Road, the news report. This stuff all comes from someplace. We want to make sure we share this stuff where it comes from, so you have a certain perspective. We've also shared later on how we're turning that ship and we're heading in a better direction, right? And this story holds the keys for not just First Nation, and even our Métis cousins, but all of Canada, all of mainstream Canada. This is how we're going to succeed going into the future. We talk about how the Indian Act and other government's policies had a detrimental effect on our people, forcing us onto the reserves. And once on the reserves, rations, for example, were used as a tool for coercion. So we describe various policies like that. In fact, we outline all of these policies that had the biggest impact. But of course, we do not shy away from talking about the residential schools. Now, when we share this story, this is not about making people feel shameful or guilty. I know you didn't create this problem. I didn't create this problem. We make sure we share this story in such a way that you get another kind of perspective in terms of where all the situations, all the issues you see in your communities and your streets, where they come from. Even if they had the best of intention in this program, it went sideways, and we are all living with the consequences. We talk about some of the abuses that happened to some of the students. We also talk about some of the emotional abuses as well, and the consequences that these kinds of abuses and traumas, how they impact not just the surviving generations, the people that actually went to the schools, but how this is manifesting in our communities today. We also talk about how this was justified historically in government policy. They wanted to get rid of the Indian problem. We also shared, interestingly enough, the fact that the Métis were not immune from this process too. A lot of Métis children were forced into the residential schools. We make sure we make that connection too. We also talk about how when the schools started closing down in the late 60s, 70s, and the 80s, 90s, and how the assimilation program was adapted and adopted to create the modern child welfare system that we have today, which is continuing that agenda. And we also describe how those policies, those programs are still impacting our communities and our families and our personal lives, even to this day. We make sure we make clear how all the damage that was done is still playing out in our communities, and how it's fed by the myths and misconceptions, and how this was also a taboo subject back home. This was a story that was not shared with the Canadian public and not even our families back home. That had impacts as well. But we also share some of the good things that are happening here today, including the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions and their calls to action. Now, this kind of work started with the Métis, with the veterans. When they came back from the Second World War in particular, they were no longer intimidated by what they called the little Hitlers. And they were starting to stand up to government officials, and they started lobbying. We got a lot of progress because of that. And things really, the doors blew open when our national chief announced publicly while he was in office that he was abused in the school he went to in Manitoba. And we described how that made it possible for our people to start sharing their stories and start their healing journeys. We described the Canadian recent history in Canada on this path towards reconciliation. We spent some time especially talking about how the settlement process worked with survivors, people that were actually abused, right? And we talk about the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and their calls to action. We describe some of these things as well and how they're playing out in modern day Canadian society, because there's some really interesting things happening in this country that the media don't often report. Now, we also almost started losing a little bit of momentum in the implementation of these calls to action. Until, for example, when the unmarked graves were discovered in some of our communities nearby some of these residential schools. And that sparked a new era, a new momentum, it was almost like a catalyst for more growth, for more connection, for more awareness in this country. And we don't dwell too much on the negative stuff, but we do use it to paint a certain picture as to where we're coming from. We also want to make sure that people understand we are making progress, that things are going forward. And this is one of the reasons why John and I get hired. Because we often get asked, especially after our seminars, is, how can I do better? I wasn't aware of this stuff. I was never taught this stuff. And now that I understand, I want to be able to do more. In fact, one of my favorite stories is we often do work in the mining communities. We were doing this one session in one of the mines east of Saskatoon here. And after the seminar, this really grizzled old miner guy, he looked like he was like months away from retirement, grizzled, kind of haggard looking, kind of tough eyes, right? We were done the seminar, he walks up to me, he's really quiet, he's purposeful. I think, okay, here we go. Gets up to me really close, he whispers in my ear, "I've been hating you people for the wrong reason." And he left. Now, I understand what he was trying to communicate, right? But the work that we do, the way we kind of try to deliver this stuff is to create allies, to clear the paths so that good men and women can work together. So that's just an example of some of the stuff that you can expect. And we share this story to clear a path so good men and women, they can work together on both sides of the fence, whether it's First Nation, Métis, or mainstream. And they can work together without the myths and the misconceptions getting in the way, impeding progress. We have a common understanding as to how we're working together, and we're using a common language as well. And we can also start building on a common vision for the future, what kind of future we want. And we also provide you guys with some practical tools and tips and techniques on what you can do to be a better ally. We talk about what you can do at work and what you can do personally when you're not at work, right? Because ultimately in this process, being a good ally makes good business sense. The kids are going to be learning this stuff anyway. The curriculum in this country is changing. So you might as well learn this stuff too, so you understand where the kids are coming from. And if you're like me, when I'm being misled or the truth is being concealed from me, I'm not a big fan of that sort of stuff. So when I learn the truth, I feel a little more empowered. I want to be able to do the right things because I'm no longer being misled. I know what's going on. And by learning this stuff as well, you're getting access to a growing market, a resource, not just more clients and customers, but you're also getting more colleagues and partners going forward. And as we all know, diversity is going to be a big issue in this country going forward. And so it's good to learn this stuff because we are starting to work together in more beautiful, wonderful ways. We still got a lot of work to do. I'm going to be honest with you, there is racism out there. But what I've found is that the overwhelming majority of men and women in this country, they're just good, decent people. They want to have good connections with us, want to do good work with us. So we provide the tools, the understanding, and the energy perhaps to form those great working relationships and maybe even friendships. Because this is the face of the future of especially First Nation and Métis communities going forward. We're getting more and more of our people are getting more connected to their culture, their history. They're just becoming better. When you have good connections with your historic, your heritage, it just makes you a better employee, better worker. It just makes you better. So you're going to get these insights by signing up, and you're going to have a fantastic process. The day will just fly by for you guys. And if you want to reach out to us, Kyle has our contact information as well. But if you have a hard time getting a hold of me, you can get a hold of my buddy John, because he's also my Indian agent. That's a little comedy. It'll become clear later on. All right, Kyle, I'm open for the comments, questions, concerns, and/or insults.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Winston. That was extremely informative, very valuable. I really appreciate you joining us. We do have some time for questions for Winston. If folks want to drop some in the chat, please feel free to do so. I'll maybe kick us off. Winston, we've got National Indigenous Peoples Day coming up on Wednesday. What are some of the things you'd recommend folks do on National Indigenous Peoples Day?
Well, what you can do is in your town, there's going to be some celebrations someplace. And so check that out on the website. The cities usually promote these things as well. There's lots of stuff on Facebook too. So go and attend. Just hang out and have a good time. Bring the family. These are very welcoming events. We welcome and respect all people coming to these things. Try some of the bannock. Don't get hooked on that stuff. It's not good for you. It's delicious, not good for you though. Check out some of the cultural displays. Some of them, there might be some vendors as well. You'll see elders and other expert storytellers doing their thing, sharing information, sharing knowledge. So just go and turn up and attend. It's a blast. They're wonderful affairs. The kids love these things too, right? Also, there's stuff, check out your local library if you want to learn more about First Nation, Métis people. Most libraries have an Indigenous learning section as well. So that's one thing you can also do. But I also highly recommend that you check out the Aboriginal People's Television Network. They got some fantastic programming there, not just documentaries, but some really hard-hitting dramas as well. And it's not all doom and gloom. There's some really cool, interesting, and funny things there as well to entertain. So family movie night, right? There you go.
Fantastic. Yeah, absolutely. For folks in Saskatoon, you can find the Cooperatives First team at Victoria Park on Wednesday. We're attending the event put off by the Friendship Center. We got a comment in the chat, not a question, rather a comment. Melissa's taken the course. Winston and John lead through Cooperatives First. Really enjoyed it, learned a lot. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Appreciate it. I've got another question, Winston. And again, if folks do have questions, feel free to shoot them in the chat or give a wave. Another question, in the course, you and John point out that acts of reconciliation don't need to be onerous. What are some things that we can do in our everyday lives that work towards reconciliation?
You know, in the seminar, John makes a really wonderful point that reconciliation, like you said, doesn't have to be a burden. It can be something that you're good at, something that you enjoy doing anyways, right? So maybe you're an artist. So maybe volunteer at the local, we got the White Buffalo Youth Lodge, for example, here in Saskatoon. Maybe they have a program there. They just need a volunteer to help teach the kids, painting or whatever your thing is. Or maybe you're a hockey coach or a ball coach. And you take a little bit of time to, give that little kid a little extra boost that he or she needs, to succeed and enjoy the sport, right? So it's little things. You're probably already doing them anyways. So just channel them and be a little more aware and have fun while you're doing it too. There's a lot of great stuff that you can do out there that does not actually work.
Fantastic. Any questions from folks on the call this morning? Feel free to drop in the chat, give a wave. Oh, John, you have a question? Go ahead.
So I'd like to say thanks to Winston and John for the course. It's thought-provoking, and to me, it's such powerful Canadian history. And the balanced perspective that you and John take as we go through our history. Because if we don't look at our history, we run the risk of repeating what was done in the past. So it's how can we be more powerful by saying we're together? And I think one of the most powerful things that you and John mentioned that has stuck with me, and it's come up to me in interesting ways in conversations, is how you emphasize that, and that the Supreme Court has backed, that our Indigenous people are rights holders, not stakeholders. And you can consult with stakeholders, but you must negotiate with rights holders. And if you choose not to negotiate, then you put yourself in the position where now you have to litigate. And I think the more people understand that the Indigenous peoples of Canada are rights holders, that's almost that, I'll call it the cornerstone of how we move forward, rather than just, oh, did we consult with them? No, that's not where our duty of care is. It's to recognize the rights and the fact that Indigenous people are rights holders. So thank you for how well you shared that message and all the other messages.
That's a brilliant insight, and I really thank you for that. That kind of gives me a fresh perspective as to how this stuff can work. But it's true. I've personally dealt with companies who take a very dim view of having to do work with Indigenous people. I just want to treat them like any old stakeholder, so you can, and if you want, ignore them, right? But there are consequences to that kind of approach, that kind of attitude. And then they're surprised and shocked and dismayed when Indian people start using, for example, the regulatory system to slow down their project. Because we're not against development. That's another myth that's out there. But we just want to be participants in the development too. We have a say that our interests are being protected and being respected, but we want to benefit as well. So we're just as interested in having jobs and training, the nice home, nice vehicle, to show the kids a good life, right? We're just as interested in that as anybody else, but we need to have our interests and our ties of land, for example, respected. Hence, we're not stakeholders, we are rights holders. And again, the point is, the work that John and I do is to provide you with the tools, the understanding that you're going to need to forge those really great connections going down the road. And it's fun too.
Fabulous. Agreed. Another comment shared in the chat from Richard. Also took the online course, was a great educational opportunity for any and all to partake in. Please share this opportunity with others to learn. And I will also say, I'm noticing more signups are rolling in as the webinar is going on. So I appreciate everyone for taking that extra step and signing up for the course. Much appreciated. Any other questions from folks for Winston this morning?
That's interesting. I feel like I'm part of one of those online television ad call in now.
Like a telemiracle, yeah, that's fantastic.
Exactly.
Yeah. Raquel asks, Jackie asks, what is the name of the course? It's called Indigenous Awareness for Co-op Leaders. And Raquel asks in the chat, seems to me duty to consult is often seen as an opportunity to mislead, and co-opt, to be an ally, is to help with information and support.
That's a brilliant insight. You know, the duty to consult and accommodate, as anything else on this planet, can be used to mislead and distort. And one of the challenges that First Nation and Métis communities have is that the lack of resources to manage these processes. But when we make the right contacts, especially with experts in the mainstream, like lawyers, people that know the money, environmental scientists, we can start making better decisions at the community level, so we can call BS when stuff is happening to us, right? Because not all corporations have our best interests at heart, and they often bamboozle and use big words to try and dazzle us and mislead us. Governments, sadly, are also subject to that as well. So what we're finding is more and more good men and women in the mainstream that have professional backgrounds or experience, they're willing, they want to help. And that's appreciated too by us.
Fabulous. Wonderful, great question. I've got another question for you, Winston. In addition to this course, are there some books, podcasts, publications that you might recommend folks check out this week for National Indigenous Peoples Day?
What I will do when we're done here, Kyle, did I share this with you before? There's a reading list that we have. Yeah. I'll share that with you again, and make sure you can distribute that to whoever takes the course again.
Fantastic. I'll share with the webinar as well, so folks will have some additional reading material or things to check out when I get in touch later this week. Hey, any other questions from folks for Winston? Feel free to drop in the chat or give a wave and ask away.
Am I still sharing screen? I'm going to turn that off.
Oh, all good. Hearing none, seeing none, going once, twice. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. A huge thank you and a virtual round of applause to Winston for joining us this morning and providing such valuable insights. We really appreciate you sharing your time, your expertise, much appreciated. National Indigenous Peoples Day is coming up on Wednesday. I hope this webinar provided some inspiration for what you can do to recognize this event, and please do check out our course.